It's my pleasure, as always, to welcome Norm Roule to the Cipher Brief studio. Norm, of course, is the former national intelligence manager for Iran, where he was the leading voice on really telling the government what we know about Iran, providing all of the intelligence. And since retiring, Norm has traveled extensively through the Middle East. He's an energy expert with deep trust here at the Cipher Brief. Norm, thank you so much for joining us as we're sort of trying to figure out where we are and where we might be headed. It's a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure for joining you. Thank you for having me with you today.
Since the U.S. strikes on these facilities in Iran, we've been seeing over the past several days that Iran may have been ramping up crude oil exports. Can you kind of put this in context for us and tell us what this might mean?
Sure. So I think the story you're talking about goes something like this. Throughout this year, Iran has exported steadily at around 1.7 million barrels of oil a day. Now, that's despite the U.S. increased sanctions on Chinese customers that began in March. Those exports have been fairly constant. What has happened in the last week is the export numbers have actually increased. Now, why would that happen? Well, what apparently is happening is that Iran's national oil company, the National Iranian Oil Company, has been increasing the number of tankers it's loading one by one on the eastern side of Harg Island, its main export terminal, and it's expediting this loading process and then moving these tankers as quickly as possible out of the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz, and then pushing its fleet of floating storage as close as possible to China. Now, that floating storage fleet is important. Iran, like most countries, maintains a fleet of tankers that store oil, and they have no customers per se, but they're there to satisfy customers that may appear when the market conditions are right. They're closer to market destinations, and Iran has, I think, something like 40 million barrels floating in its storage fleet. I think that's the number that's in my head, and it's about 35 vessels, something like that. I may be off. And of course, most of these are going to be in Asia because Iran's primary customer is in China. So basically what we've seen is people who have watched this for a living have seen that a number of tankers have moved closer to China. About 8 million barrels are now stationed directly offshore China. They were previously near Singapore, where there are about twice as many, maybe 2.5 times as many barrels still sitting. And the remainder are still floating somewhere between the Persian Gulf and China. Now, why would you do this? Well, you would do this for a couple of reasons. First, if you thought oil prices were going to spike and you wanted to take advantage of high prices suddenly, you've got something, close to your consumer. If you thought for some reason those ships might be interdicted, it's a long drive from the Persian Gulf to the Shandong Peninsula independent refineries, the teapots as they're known. You're closer to those destinations. You have a less risky journey. And of course, if you're going to cut off the Strait of Hormuz by closing the strait for some reason, and China being your number one consumer, you're able to satisfy that consumer by having those vessels nearby and providing a ready supply of hydrocarbon products to satisfy the contract requirements you have with the Chinese refineries until the crisis ends and the Strait of Hormuz opens up again. So I think that's the story that you're probably talking about, but that's off the top of my head, based off of what I believe the situation is as it's developing this week.
Phenomenal context around that, Norm. It really does help us understand a little bit better what's happening. Let me ask you, the response of the Gulf Cooperation Council is rather important at this time after the U.S. strikes in Iran. Can you talk to me a little bit about how the GCC is responding?
So, as always, the Gulf Cooperation Council works quietly. Their diplomacy is always rather intense. Their cooperation with the United States is always quite good. They have a heavy focus on security, but also a heavy focus on macroeconomics and geopolitics, market stability, maintaining supply and satisfying demand for global economies on energy products is important, but are important. But at the same time, they have their national economies and requirements to consider. So when you're looking at the Persian Gulf, for example, or the Arabian Gulf, as some would say, a tremendous amount of foodstuffs come through that waterway every day for the countries of the Gulf, to include Iran itself, by the way. In some cases, 90% of the foodstuffs transit the Gulf for the smaller Gulf states. So they have critical requirements in that world. So when people talk about the Gulf states being delighted with the strikes against Iran, I think perhaps to an extent they're not unhappy with the blows against Iran's nuclear program, of course, or the blows against the diminish Iran's missile program. But the prospects of instability in Iran, the prospects of Iran striking out in the Gulf itself and interrupting the flow of trade and commerce has profound consequences for their core national security and economic objectives and requirements that we just don't feel or understand 6,500 miles away or think about. Now, at the same time, when it comes to their security, which they think about often in terms of partnership with the United States, they think about as a unified whole. The GCC works best together. There's a lot of quiet coordination and leadership behind the scenes. My prediction, this is more of my sense of things, I would say, is that they probably have agreed that they're going to stand together to oppose any expansion of violence in the region. That's easy. Any strikes from their region against Iran, they're not going to support the United States attacking Iran from U.S. bases. That's easy. And of course, not allowing Israel to use their airspace to attack Iran. Of course, that's easy. But there's a reverse to this, and that is if Iran were to be imprudent to the degree of it would strike U.S. bases or the territory of these countries, it's striking the airspace, the waterways of these countries, and they would act as a whole. So I think without saying it, my sense would be that if you strike one, you strike them all. And that sort of unity isn't often considered as people think about the Gulf Cooperation Council responses. The coordination that usually takes place between our security, defense entities is usually quite robust, always very quiet. And again, they're not looking to create a fight, but if a fight's going to happen, they want it to be quick and efficiently handled with minimum damage to all involved.
Mm-hmm. We've spoken a little bit earlier with General David Petraeus, Norman. One of the things that a lot of folks have been speculating about is whether Iran might mine the Strait of Hormuz or close the Strait of Hormuz. I'd really love to know what you think about, number one, the likelihood of whether they will make the decision to do this, and then how long they would be able to sustain sort of the blowback from doing that.
Well, let's talk about the decision-making environment in Tehran. So here's the story. You're the supreme leader of Iran, and already a female has been made a supreme leader of Iran. So we can see the progress that has been made in the world out there. So you're the supreme leader, and you see how bad things are. Now you're in hiding, right? You've had threats to your life, right?
Yeah.
How are communications going? You've got a change in leadership around you and your military. They're being hunted by the Israelis by all accounts. There are ongoing attacks going on in the throughout your government. You've got your air defenses are non-existent in many ways. Your offensive capabilities are being eroded almost daily. And in fact, the Israelis are increasingly confronting, but also defeating missile attacks farther and farther east into Iran. Now, in the midst of all of this, you have to make the decision on how to coordinate the greatest expansion of Iran aggressive moves against not only the United States, but against China. It would touch China, touch all of your partners, touch your Gulf neighbors, and you need to hold this strategic conversation. My goodness, that's a tough decision-making environment. But let's say the decision has been made, and the Iranians are now going to close the Gulf. How would they do that? Well, they have a number of tools. There has already been significant evidence of GPS jamming. The jamming is dangerous because what it could lead to is ships believing they're in international waters. The strait is about, I think it's 21 miles across with several lanes that are only a few miles across in each direction. So when people think of the strait, they think it's 21 miles, you go anywhere you want, but it's really 21 miles and you stay in certain lanes that are much narrower. So if you go out of those lanes, you start drifting into the national waters of each country. I want to unpack that a little bit because it's very important. It could actually become so important it's an international crisis. If you were to look at the international maps for the lines of control, economic control, historic control, borders, et cetera, and you were to say, what does Iran believe it owns? What does America believe it owns? What does the United Nations believe someone owns? You would see a rather complicated set of multicolored lines. Now, all it takes is a ship to go out of that lane to go into somebody else's line. And you now have Iran with the capacity to say, you've crossed into our territory and we think you have a sanitation problem on your ship and we're going to capture you. Mm-hmm. And that's $1 billion cargo taken. So already, just with GPS jamming, Iran has a capacity to cause significant problems in the region. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, Iran's capacity to just close the strait, if they wanted to do that, would involve probably 4 separate tools. The first tool, of course, that people talk about are mines. And mines, when people think about them, we normally think, well, I do because I'm old-fashioned. You think about World War I mines, round with spikes. They're big and clunky, and the guys are wearing the pea coats and throwing them overboard. Mines are very complicated. They can be thrown underwater, float underwater. They can be GPS driven. They're very difficult to locate. And for this reason, they're very difficult to, it's important that you get ahead of them. Iran has a very sophisticated mine stable. If Iran were to mine the strait, we would have to arrest that very quickly. You just have to imagine how long does it take to throw mines into the water versus how long does it take to locate the mines and to make sure that lane is clear, to send ships north. And by the way, we're talking mines that are under the water, so you don't necessarily see them. Then you have Iran using speedboats with personnel using RPGs, rockets, machine guns, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have Iran using coastal defense missiles. If Iran were to put all this out, would they be able to close the Strait of Hormuz? Absolutely, sure. Mm-hmm. Would they be able to keep it closed for a long time? Probably not. How long would they be able to do so? I think the answer is the one that policymakers always hated from the intelligence community. It depends. Yeah. It depends on the nature of the conflict, the tools, what assets we have in the region. But there are at least 2 aircraft carrier task forces in the region. I don't know exactly how much demining capacity we have in the region. Our aircraft would be able to make a fairly rapid work of the coastal defense batteries that are in the region. The last time we faced something like this would have been in the tanker war. Our technology even has significantly improved since then. We would have partners not only from the Gulf Cooperation Council states. It's their interest to do this. The British, I think the French have a presence in the region as well. So it's a multinational force that's working this. It could be as long as a few weeks. What does that mean if that's happening? That's where you start getting first your oil prices are skyrocketing, of course. But there you've got your container storage, your floating storage abroad, your releases from the United States, your strategic releases from other countries. China has, I think, the largest amount in its strategic reserves since COVID. Other countries have similar strategic reserves that they would be asked to release, but it's not unreasonable to think that oil would go to $120 to $140 a barrel. And then the time would impact how that hits inflation, how that hits growth, unemployment. The president would obviously push for lower interest rates. You can just sort of see how the many wheels start turning on this. I think that I would be paying as much attention, however, to container traffic. There's a tremendous amount of container traffic through the area. There's a tremendous amount of natural gas. 20% of the global natural gas flow goes through the Gulf. You're watching a tremendous amount of propane, butane, ethane. I think probably about 26% of the world's total is coming, and you're shutting down, in some cases, the primary sources for entire countries. Qatar supplies a vast amount of the gas for China, India, Pakistan, South Korea, Japan. They would be turning to other suppliers, Australia, for example. I think the Australians supply something like 37% of their gas goes to Asia, perhaps to Japan itself. I think I would also look at the chemical industry. People don't usually look at the Gulf in terms of chemicals, but particularly since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the chemical exports from the Gulf area, think methanol, which comes from natural gas and other chemicals, and fertilizers have increased significantly from the Gulf. So you'd really want to lay out almost a spreadsheet that would say all of the various commodities that come out of the Gulf industries, or the precursor supporters items that produce the commodities that produce these items, and then what downstream industries are going to be very rapidly impacted. And just to pull that thread, and I know I'm throwing a lot out there, but as I mentioned, I think in the discussion we had yesterday, when the Iranian missile attacks began on Israel, they closed their Leviathan gas field down, and that provides a massive amount of its product to Egypt. And Egypt's fertilizer industry virtually stopped overnight. And it took some very urgent negotiations and the restoration of security over the Leviathan for Egypt's fertilizer industry to start again. So you could look at all of these different industries, and suddenly you're saying, what does this have to do with limestone to India or Bangladesh, or cement or clinker going to Africa? And you start thinking about things that just don't really come to the conversation as often as oil and gas. And the reverse of that is suddenly going to be, well, how do these Gulf countries get the sugar, the corn, the wheat, the barley, the soybeans that they were receiving last week? And how is that going to be shipped by land from other areas? And what then does this produce going down the line in terms of future relationships? And I know I'm bouncing all over the place, as I often do. And this is why you and your listeners probably hate it when you reach out. But when you look at the creation of something like Oxagon, which the Saudis are doing at Neom, it shows why that port is so important. Because if you're able to put together a port such as Oxagon, all ports are like all real estate, location is everything. Having that port in the location where Neom has been so smartly put, it allows you to bring material in through the Suez Canal, and then 65 kilometers away, you're dropping it off at Oxagon, and then you're shipping it across to the entire Arabian Peninsula and Iraq, overcoming any vulnerability to closure of the Gulf. So you can see how this really fits into a lot of different schemes and economic macro planning and infrastructure development.
It's incredible how connected it all is, Norman, how quickly you can feel the effects of this when things start to break down. Let me
And
just
it's a
ask you,
lot more than oil, isn't it?
yeah,
And
a
when you
lot more
think
than
about the
oil.
Strait of
Yes,
Hormuz, people only
yes,
think about it in terms of a tanker of
massive amount.
oil, and they
Yeah,
don't think about it in terms of, soybeans or
yeah.
ethanol or limestone. I mean, it's a tremendously complicated ecosystem.
Yeah. Norm, in closing, what are you keeping your eye on next in terms of indicators about where we might be headed?
I actually go into Iran itself, and what I'm looking for are indicators of erosion of control, or
Hmm.
erosion of leadership grasp on the organs of state.
Hmm.
Again, going to that leadership conversation that you've got, I mentioned all of the problems that people have in decision making. At the same time, there are hundreds or thousands of mid-level officers who run the state's organs of coercion. And they are the people who are right now, no doubt, looking for protesters, looking for signs of disloyalty, probably rounding up or putting pressure on people they suspect of being disloyal. But the first signs of serious unrest will not be a single protest. It won't be someone waving an American flag or something like that. It really would be, the one I would really look for would be when an area falls out of Iran's control. And that might be a whole lot of truckers not going on strike, but driving strikers en masse to another city. It might be a town or series of towns that in essence say, we're not listening to Tehran anymore. They don't have to be big towns, but they would be towns. It might be in Ahvaz, might be in Baluchistan, might be somewhere. And the government is unable to send forces to reassert control easily. And that would show rot. And I want to pull that thread just a little bit, because I think we've discussed previously of how odd I thought it was that the Quds Force was unable to prove itself capable of managing the drive of HTS from Aleppo to Damascus. And that was an organizational failure. Now, is it possible that rot has set into Iran's security services? Well, this is going to be the ultimate test. And it's a very courageous thing for people to stand up at a moment like this and put their lives on the line in a crowd. And those people who are urging protests in Iran, I understand why they're doing so, but this is a very, very brave, demanding moment for people, and the Iranian people are putting a lot on the line, and we need to stand with them and take care of them, but not urge people to their deaths unreasonably.
Norm Roule, former national intelligence manager for Iran and energy expert and the leading energy experts in the world. Norm, thank you so much
Yeah.
for taking the time to chat with us. Really appreciate having you here.
Thank you, Suzanne.